Federica Rossi. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Innovation Management Research, or CIMR. I am also Reader in Innovation Policy and Management at Birkbeck, University of London. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the CIMR debate in public policy on the theme measurement of interdisciplinarity and synergy. This is a very interesting theme because interdisciplinarity is increasingly discussed as a solution to the problem of producing and creating new knowledge, developing innovative, original, creative solutions to complex problems. However, the discussion of what interdisciplinarity means is quite limited, and there are some sort of specific areas of academic research that focus on this. But in general, it's quite as, it's a conversation that is happening in specific area of academic research. One of these is bibliometric, and Professor Leydesdorff, who is our presenter today, is one of the leading academics working in this area. In particular, his work on measuring interdisciplinarity and synergy brings strong rigor to grappling with the problem of what does interdisciplinarity mean, what are the various possible dimensions of interdisciplinarity, and what are the implications of interdisciplinarity and synergy for the production of new knowledge. So let me introduce our speakers today. Then our first speaker is Professor Loet Leydesdorff, who is Professor Emeritus at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research of the University of Amsterdam. And he has associate faculty positions at several institutions around the world, including here at CIMR, so we're of course delighted to have him as a fellow here at CIMR. Loet has published extensively in system theory, social network analysis, scientometrics, and the sociology of innovation. And with Henry Escovis, he initiated a series of workshop conferences and special issues about the well-known triple helix of university government, industry-government relations. Loet has an H index of 105 and nearly 60,000 citations, which shows how influential his work is on the work of other academics. Today's discussant is Adrian, who is a knowledge exchange policy consultant, whom we are also delighted to have as a CIMR member. Adrian has spent nearly 20 years working at the interface between academia and the economy. His work has included developing strategies as well as designing data and funding systems, including the HIVE, the HEPKI, and the CEF. When anyone who is working in universities will be familiar with this acronym, because they are very important policy initiatives that the UK government has implemented in relation to universities' knowledge exchange activities. Adrian has worked for the Higher Education and Funding Council for England for a long time, but he did set up his own consultancy in 2016, and he has since worked with universities across the research spectrum and advised international partners in developing their strategic approach to innovation, enterprise, and knowledge exchange. So I think that Adrian can provide an interesting viewpoint on the extent to which the different concepts and measurements of interdisciplinarity and synergy can help us to better design policies for research and help universities to better understand their own processes of knowledge creation. So I'm going to leave the floor to our speakers. I think that Loet will talk for about 20 minutes and 20-25, as long as you need, and then we will have a 5-10 minutes discussion from Adrian, and we will make sure that we have some time at the end for questions from the audience. Okay, so Loet, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Federica. It's always a pleasure to work with you and Helen. You have really made a beautiful center, and I'm very happy that you asked me to give this presentation. We worked before on the triple helix in London together, and it was a pleasure. Okay, let me just jump into this slide in order to give you a sense that interdisciplinarity in itself has been debated since the 1970s. These were more or less metaphorical discussions about what is inter, what is multi, what is transdisciplinarity, until particularly Andy Sterling from SPRU introduced the concepts of diversity from ecology and made them relevant to the debate. This is on the left side on the, here you see it, and someone did a full dissertation about the discussions about interdisciplinarity. There's an article, a review article by Caroline Wagner and among others Ismail Raffles, who has been important in this field. And this is the article by Andy Sterling, which is the starting point for thinking more in a qualitative and systematic way about interdisciplinarity. The notion of synergy has a very different background. It comes from systems theory. It's related to thinking about mode 2, triple helix, and that type of things. But synergy, of course, is more externally oriented. And I have a background where I also have this in one of my interests, sign shops and external orientations. And it extends this collaborations which are not necessarily cognitive, which can be framed from a policy perspective. It has strongly the connotation of crossing boundaries with others than academics in relation to third party and social relevance. The issues are long-term debates, but more recently, I think I highlighted them here in red, the people who I have to thank for their collaborations. With Caroline and Wagner and Lutz Bormann, we have made indicators for this. I'll come back to that in a moment. Part of this presentation is based on a paper with Inga Ivanova from Moscow, which came just out in the Journal of JSIST, the former journal. And here I mention Helen in a paper where some of the materials which I will use come from that paper. Particularly at the data end, I'll give an introduction to the notions of interdisciplinarity and synergy, but I also want to make it empirical, and I will use the annual report 2020 made by Helen and use this data, pages 22 to 27, where they list the scientific output. Among them, 12 articles could be retrieved from the Web of Science, and these 12 articles cite 17 journals 10 or more times, and I will use that matrix of 12 over 17, but in principle, of course, this is not limited to textual units of analysis, but that will come later, but just to tell you what the data is which I will use. These are those 12 articles. One of them is here.
Sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your slides moving. I think you might need to get out of presentation mode and try and move your slides forward. Sorry.
Okay, I think I'm out of everything now. Can you now see the slide?
Yes, we do now.
Okay. Okay, so these are the 12 articles, and among them is Federica Rossi's article here. You can see that in the third position. But the question is, can I now move my slides? Yes. So I'm now turning first to interdisciplinarity, and then thereafter I will turn to synergy. Andy Sterling, I already mentioned that, has written this beautiful article where he made the point that interdisciplinarity at least should have 3 elements: variety, balance, and disparity. Disparity, wrongly written here, is new. Variety and balance have been before. It means that if you have a collaboration between someone from the natural sciences and from women's studies, that's more at the disparity, longer distance between them. And Ismail Raffles and Martin Meyer have made this picture, which is more or less iconographic for the idea that we have these 3 elements. If you formalize that, that's how Andy did it. Here we have, oh, now my animations will not work. Anyhow, I'll do as good as I can. Here you have Andy Sterling's, he made this formula from it, but essentially what he did is he added the disparity term, which is here to the right, and used the Simpson index as a measure for variety and balance. And in recent years, and that's some of the publications with Caroline and Lutz, which I mentioned, we thought that it was no longer needed to do that we could use the three terms separately by identifying balance with 1 minus Gini. There's a literature about that, and that can be done. And then variety, balance, and disparity. It's a complex term, but essentially it is 1 minus cosine as we operationalize it. Then we can have the three terms separate, and we no longer have the idea, which is in the Simpson indicator, that we have a dual, they call it dual use. We get a better indicator, in our opinion, because all these terms vary between 0 and 1, so you can multiply them by each other, and you get refinements, and that's allowed. Let me see. I will have. This has been further improved. This is still background to true diversity, which is a development which comes from ecology. In true diversity is different from the previous measures to the point that if you have a value which is twice the value of another set or another sample, then you are allowed to say that it is twice the times that you can compute with it. You can say 20% diversity plus 10% diversity is together 30% diversity. That's allowed. So you're no longer bound between 0 and 1. That's a disadvantage. But on the other hand, you have more for the comparison. It has better applications. For the diff, which I just defined a moment ago, here underneath, for the diff, Roland Rousseau told us that if he would if he operationalized variety only as this term and not as previously divided by the sum total, then it would also be a measure of true diversity. So we are using that one now, also nowadays. Of course, this is very much an applied field driven by applied interests. I'll come to synergy in a moment for which it is different, but in this case it's very applied, and people just are looking for an indicator, and we try to work on that in different formations, quite a large group. A thing which I did, I'm rather proud upon, is I made software where people can just feed data matrix in, and then the units of analysis, the columns in particular, will be compared, and you will have all these measures like the Gini, the Shannon, the Simpson, and also the new measures which are just introduced in a table which you can feed back into Excel, and then you have them all. This is publicly available. You can work with it, and I highlight this one because this one also has the synergy as one of the possibilities, which I will now shortly introduce. But this one is slower because of that additional layer. Synergy is more computationally intensive than the previous formulas. Okay, let me show you using those 12 articles from the annual report of the center. We here have the affiliations matrix. It is the affiliations matrix citing is the proper matrix, the proper picture also, which follows from that, because interdisciplinarity is now conceptualized as co-citing, not co-cited, but co-citing. So making references to different types of literature. The more you do that, the more you get interdisciplinarity in this conceptualization. And so it's also called bibliographic coupling in psychometrics. It's the same notion that papers, in this case those 12 papers, are coupling different literatures, and the extent to which they do that make them more or less interdisciplinary. So here you have the two measures, and you see they're not congruent. There are some differences, and in a very recent paper, which is still under submission, with Lin Zhang from Wuhan University, I think we made a very convincing case. Actually, we did it together because she is the originator of this true diversity measure in using now Sterling diversity, derived from Sterling's intervention, and this is our new indicator, and from this comparison we concluded that this one has several advantages above that one. So if one wants to, we dare to say now that this is perhaps the best to use. So I organized it here on this measure, rank ordered, and let's see, here Federica is on the second position. Of course, I don't know precisely who the other people are, but Helen, in the paper which we did together, have said some things about that. I just wanted to show you, because it hangs together, and we will come back to the relation between the two. But I now want to do synergy, which is the other measure, and I already made the point that I hope. Let me see what I can show you this more. So I hope you still see something. Do you?
Yes, we do. We see your slide on synergy.
Okay. So there's always a discussion about whether innovation systems are national, regional, or sectorial. And the question, of course, is what is the system behind that? And the point which I want to make here is that a system is more than the sum of its parts. And it means that at the systems level, there is some synergy, that there is not just a summation of the parts, but without that notion of synergy, the word system becomes a rhetorical issue. So, for example, the Catalan government is always saying that there's a Catalan innovation system, but we searched for that and we couldn't find it, because there's a Spanish innovation system, and people, of course, are upset if you say that, but we need the notion of synergy, because, and we have the option in the case of an innovation system, that an innovation system could have more options than the sum of its parts. An innovation system is a system insofar as synergy is generated. And what does synergy do? It adds options to a system. And an innovation system which runs out of options becomes deadlock, and it has negative synergy, you could say. Options are most important, and options are another word in technical language of mathematical theory of communication, Shannon's theory of redundancy. Redundancy means options, and I can show that in the next picture. Can you still see this? Are you seeing this? Hello?
I still see your slide with synergy, Loet.
But you can see this one too? No, you can't. Okay, then I'll get out of this.
Yes,
so then okay, here originally I was going to focus on this left part picture. This is from biology, evolution is entropy. So here you can see that the entropy is always increasing, and the difference between the maximum entropy and the realized entropy is the redundancy in systems theory, in information science also. And above that, for people who have had it in school, will be understand that, others will find it more difficult. But the issue is that from a biological perspective, you cannot measure outside the system. You have a maximum number of options in the system. So this is the idea of that there is, for example, Malthus. There's a limit to a system which is bound. This concept of impossible is reformulated in the right picture, where I say you can have technologically possible, made possible options. And this is the crucial point of moving from a biological concept to a cultural evolution concept, where we can make options available. So, for example, if you compare New York with New Delhi or with Calcutta, then you will see that in New York there are much more communication channels, for example, sewage systems and things like that, which makes it technologically more advanced, and things which were previously impossible from a biological perspective are now made technologically feasible. So this is the background idea about the synergy concept. How can there be more options than the sum of the parts? And I hope to show this with this picture, which comes from the triple helix, of course, in the background. So here you have the whole as overlapping sets. You can have the case that the overlapping sets don't have an overlap in the common denominator. You can also have the case that there is a kind of whole here, and we will see that this is a negative term. So other possibilities outside are different from the internal possibilities which are created, and I'll try to show that in the next picture. So we use that in the triple helix discussions to say that here you have an integration, but here you have the possibility to have this overlay, which is it's called in triple helix discussions, but it is essentially the same idea, that there's additional options possible when three dynamics operate upon each other. That makes the triple helix so interesting. Actually, this can be calculated, and we can do that also for the type of things which we are going to do in a moment. I just switched to this presentation because I want to show you this in extenso. Here you see, if you don't correct for the overlap, you would count it twice. So this is called the transmission or the mutual information, and you can reshuffle it. And you can see that this is otherwise twice, and that is called also another notion of redundancy, because it is already once and it is an additional time. So, and then we can say that the redundancy is the negative of the overlap, the negative of the mutual information, where it is corrected. This can also be done for three, most easily. It's most straightforward. And here you get the situation that if R is smaller, R is in this case T1, 2, 3, the mutual information in 3 dimensions. If that is smaller than 0, then new options are available. So it is the negative which is important, and the negative, of course, has to do with the idea which we had a moment ago, that we have a whole here. This whole, and I'll switch again to this presentation, this whole comes in as a negative term. It means the entropy is a positive one, it's uncertainty, and this synergy reduces uncertainty. So therefore it is a negative term. We can do this for the 12 articles, for example, because it is not limited to 3. If you have a set of 15 or 12, you can always decompose them in all possible combinations of three, and you get, and I have done that here, the possible triads are this formula. This can be derived, and if you have the 12, then you see you have, if you fill this out, you get 220 possibilities. But of course, a computer can just do that. So we take, I have here worked it out for 4, just to show you. In the case of 4, you get 4 possibilities. You get V1, V2, V2, 3, but you get also V1, V2, V4. And each of those possibilities has a certain synergy or a potential synergy. Not every combination does have to have a synergy, but in this case they have all a value. You see that this one has a much less synergy than this one. You are then allowed to count that together, to sum that up, and you can, for all of the nodes, all of the 12 articles in this case, you can compute the contribution to the overall synergy in the system of 12 nodes. And you can also do that for the links. Eventually you can do this for the whole network, but I just did it here for the set. Oh no, this should have not be in here. This comes because of I have to switch here again. Can you see this? Is there still someone listening?
Yeah, we can.
You can see it. And this is 12, the 12 articles again, but now in a synergy map. And the program which I just showed you gives you immediately the files which you can feed into program like phosphor.
Synergy map, no, we cannot see the synergy map.
Okay, here we go.
That's it, yeah.
Now you can see it. Outspokenly, someone called Balset is, he may be in the audience. He is the one who leads the synergy, but Federica is here. If you quantify it, you can see it. It's outspoken, and he is a postdoc. He was a postdoc in the unit, and particularly we hypothesize that postdocs, when they function well, may have that function. And of course, having a paper in the Cambridge Journal of Economics is an excellent contribution. And being a postdoc in an innovation unit, a unit which is studying innovation, is as an economist brings him in the position to have that type of synergy. Just to give you an impression that it is not limited to articles or bibliometrics. Here you have the international co-authorship relations among 6 Western Mediterranean countries in 2009. And if I do the synergy map, you can see that here France, with its 3 colonies, its 3 former colonies on the other side of the Mediterranean, has synergy in the relations, while Spain and Italy have only synergy in their relations with France. So it's just to give you an idea that you can also do it for that type. So actually, for everything which you can measure in terms of 3 variables or more variables, but which can eventually be tabled in an Excel sheet, you can compute this synergy measure. This is going into more detail about those 6 countries. I want now to go to my conclusions and perspectives, and then one more slide. Policymakers call for interdisciplinarity, but they often mean synergy. So synergy is, in my opinion, the more important concept from a social perspective than interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is the concept which is important for research management. Interdisciplinarity can be measured using diversity measures from ecology and economics. We have made, over the last 5 to 10 years, quite a way to go there. Synergy, however, is not originate. The concept of synergy doesn't come from the application in research management, but it comes from the systems theory and the mathematical theory of communication, the Shannon type theory, and it can be applied from that perspective to any data. So it's from a very different intellectual tradition. It's particularly in the work with Inga Ivanova, who I mentioned before, that we have come to the point that we can now measure it and automate also that measurement. What I showed you in terms of those permutations means that you can also, if you have a data set, you can ask the computer to sort out which of the combinations, for example, if you have regions in a country, like in 40 regions in Italy, you can ask whether the combination Piedmont, Lombardia, or Piedmont with another region is synergetic or not, and you can sort out what would be the optimal units in terms of producing synergy. We did that in a couple of units, but of course people may not wish to hear that. I already said when we found that Catalan was not an innovation system in terms of how we define it, in terms of the measurement, then people were so upset that half of the audience had left the meeting before I was finished. So I think particularly this new notion of synergy is highly relevant for innovation policy, because an innovation system is a system insofar as it is synergetic, insofar as it generates redundancy. If it doesn't, it can more or less become deadlocked because it becomes exhausted. It also has a very important implication for bibliometric work, because bibliometric work is now focusing on past performance. Well, I think it's more important for a system to have options than to have options realized. The open options, of course, it is not objective in a certain sense, but defining the system theoretically sets the number of options, and by calculating that, you get at least an information about where there are options and where things are running out of steam. So I was already mentioning this discussion about Piedmont and Lombardy. The definitions of an innovation system have to be made as hypothesis, and then this type of measures can provide you the significance of the synergy in the systems which are under study. And that can even be worked out in terms of statistics, but that's another chapter. So that's what I wanted to say, and I am happy to hand the floor to Andy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Loet, for your fascinating presentation. And I think the possibilities for further research offered by these indicators are absolutely fascinating. So it's a very interesting, paper to hear, and to know that you've already prepared the software. Also, I think we appreciate that you've shown how to implement this index using our own articles from some of us in CIMR, and I think there will be a few more questions about that later, about the implications of your findings. But now let me leave the floor to Adrian. Who can maybe offer some comments on this presentation. If you would like to stop sharing, Loet, that would be okay. It's up to you. Okay, thank you.
Fabulous. So again, I hope everyone can see me and hear me. At the moment, I can mainly see a black screen in front of me, but I will sort of carry on and say, That's better, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I think I followed most of the formulae. That was the bit that was making my brain hurt a little bit. But this is the kind of stuff that I love to see, because I think it's genuinely innovative in terms of actually how we are talking about these things. Obviously, we spend a lot of time generally talking about scale and quantity. So having something actually intelligent to look at and to critique is perhaps, one of the things I really look forward to. So, I mean, very quickly to make 3 basic points in terms of how I think this may be used as such. I'll talk a bit about, the public funding of research in particular. I think as well, the detail in terms of disciplines, particularly learned societies, is something that we've been working on recently, and this could be another angle. And then perhaps mention how this could be used internally in institutions, or at least I'm asking questions, would this be a good idea, do you think? So initially, in terms of public funding, the reason that we want data is initially to make the case for public funding in universities for research and teaching and knowledge exchange, and then, of course, to look at what that level should be, and then to actually decide how to allocate money between universities. And my sense is the theory is a useful one here. I can certainly use this to be able to make a case that we could make more sophisticated, more constructive public investment in research by using these indicators. What I'm nervous about is giving too much power to some of my ex-colleagues within those funding departments. The UK has an idea called the Haldane Principle, which is that politicians should not be directly involved in making decisions about what research gets funded. That should be a non-partisan argument. And I'm just a little bit nervous that some of the special advisors that we might have around, or may recently had around, if people can think about the person I'm talking about who was in number 10 and writing blogs, this is the kind of thing that potentially might get misused, would be one question I would want to ask. How do we make sure that it isn't basically taken to benefit someone's particular hobby horse, or to be the detriment of things we may find more valuable? But yeah, like I say, that's just a risk that I'm a bit scared about. I think the next point, of course, is in terms of, well, allocation models. This does look a bit complicated for the way in which we allocate funding, but my sense is where you would build it in would be into assessment. And so either via whatever framework you have in terms of the REF as it currently is, but being able to use a more intelligent, sophisticated measure to get towards this level of interdisciplinarity, when of course most research assessment is based on units of assessment, which tend to be therefore a little bit awkward for those working in disciplinary work. That strikes me as being potentially a very useful opportunity. Again, moving on briefly, say there's been some work done by the Physiological Society looking at the contribution physiology makes. Part of the reason because it's one of those disciplines that perhaps doesn't really get the profile that it used to, despite the fact that it's absolutely vital for a number of the global challenges we're facing. If you're looking at sort of, not to even mention COVID, but healthy aging and so forth. These are not single discipline questions, these are interdisciplinary questions. And physiology is not going to answer all of them, but it's absolutely vital to the answers we're looking for in terms of how the human body acts as a system, if I can make that slight play on words. So my sense again is that sort of these learned societies would find this material extraordinarily useful to be able to demonstrate why their material is A, valuable on its own, but also B, feeds into the rest of this academic endeavor. The third point I'd make as well would be perhaps around internal institutional management and resource allocation, reward, progression, because it's one of the things, again, that is fairly common, certainly in the UK. What are the barriers to doing more research, doing more knowledge exchange? It's generally time. Time and resource is the thing. Everyone wants to do more of these things, but there are literally only so many hours in a day, or so many days in a week. So one of the ways to look at that is to say, well, if I'm trying to decide between am I doing more research or doing more knowledge exchange, well, look for opportunities where you're doing both of those things at once, the synergy in that sort of policy term. So again, my sense is that this is a conversation which I've had recently as a consultant, which caught me a bit by surprise. As a public servant, as a civil servant, I would be happy to make the case that it's important universities have senior management buy-in in terms of the importance of research and knowledge exchange, and that there are systems in place to progress reward staff for those activities. When I was recently asked, okay, how do we implement that? I sort of panicked a bit, because as a civil servant, I can sit back and say, well, it's not my job. It's not my place to tell universities how to run themselves. It's really down to you to work out how to do that. I'm just going to basically make some clever points and hopefully walk away. Now, as a consultant, I'm being required to say, well, yes, how would we actually implement that? How would we actually demonstrate that we are changing the way in which review systems work, progression works, recruitment works, in order to be able to actually capitalize on these areas? And that's the point where I think, within reason, some of the complexity of this work that would be difficult to describe to government and might be a little bit risky when applied at the national level would be extraordinarily important as it could be produced by the academics themselves to demonstrate the value of their work and their activity to their managers, and therefore to make that case for resource allocation and for reward internally. So, I mean, I think partly I would like to see Loet's response to some of those points to see whether, have I kind of got that right? Do you see the usage as being, in terms of the national level, I can see why it makes a case, but there's a potential risk that it could be misused by those whose motives aren't entirely pure. I can see the fact that actually on the discipline based, those who are really specialists in disciplines, that could be massively useful. And again, then potentially at the internal level for institutions, in terms of those conversations about research source allocation and progression, that would be another place to be useful. Does that sort of make sense, Zoe?
Thank you so much for your interesting questions. Of course, I'm not a policy analyst, which makes it a bit different, but I've witnessed over my lifetime how much people build on indicators which are sometimes very erroneous. Actually, we just had a paper about China and the US, and people are making normalizations in the denominator which are just plainly wrong. They take averages over skewed distributions. And we had this type of discussions in psychometrics quite a bit. And it's amazing how well people can do policies with the wrong indicators, with erroneous indicators. That's most worrisome. On the other hand, if you introduce a new concept like synergy, or in Helga Novotny in 1994 and Mike Gibbons introduced Mode 2, people are so versatile nowadays in wanting to get money that there is a bureaucratic competency present for people to absorb these concepts and to jungle with them and to make it look like, I mean, a decent proposal nowadays will explain to you that they're gender mainstreamed, it's interdisciplinary, it will solve all kinds of questions. Everybody is capable of doing that. And the question, I think one of the critical functions I can still see is to say, oh, wait a moment, is that the case? Is it interdisciplinary? Is it helpful in that respect? I'm not saying that we should all be interdisciplinary. Of course, lots of work has to be done disciplinary, but at least we should try to be a bit honest about those things. One concern in particularly, and that's a paper which I did, Ismail Rafels was the first author at SPRU at the time, and he looked in the effect of the assessment procedures for interdisciplinary research, and that was shocking. There was a negative effect, which was significant in the case of interdisciplinary units having to suffer because of delineations in the apparatus. We all know that, and then it may be helpful to have this type of instruments available. Misuses, I don't see it differently from people trying to make it a metaphor and to use it as a metaphor, and then to, yeah, I think it always helps if there's a possibility to check it, to test it, what people make as claims. Whether people are really interested in that, that's a different. I would be hesitant to immediately couple it to allocation mechanisms. I think that's a type of thinking which is very UK-like. On the continent, we haven't that strongly that coupling. I think there's always a phase between what you want and what is feasible. To be, perhaps it's possible in using this measure also to say something about what could be done and what has been done, that distinction to make it. And yeah, of course, I'm now in the stage that I'm proposing this, and that I'm not criticizing it. It's up to others to take that. How to use it internally, that was your, I think, your last question. I think it's most interesting to run it. It may be surprising that you have something counterintuitive coming out of it, that there is synergy possible between units. Of course, I'm now retired, but when I was at the University of Amsterdam, at a certain moment, someone made a report about internal strengths and weaknesses, and the information theory unit then suddenly came out as a very strong point of the University of Amsterdam, while the authors involved didn't know each other. They were in different faculties. But if you compose the whole thing, if you can do that on a large scale, you cannot do that by hand for every. But one of the advantages of using the computer is you can do that for 300 units and run it overnight. And then at least you have in your hands that there is synergy in the organization which you hadn't seen.
That's fantastic. Again, fascinating. I think I do understand now that this is a sense of going, again, perhaps I'm used to people thinking they've already got all the answers worked out. So the idea that this is actually not an answer, this is actually a few questions and a few suggestions of things we can work on. That seems like exactly where we should be able to use it, because as you say, I will always think about allocation methods. That's my background and generally my role to play. Unfortunately, I don't have the focus to make the contribution of being an academic, so I try to do what I can as the one in the middle or the buffer. But I think the point, again, in certainly great research assessment as such, is that interdisciplinary work is still not really picked up properly in the way that we want to see it. And this would be one method potentially by not putting interdisciplinary work over anything else, but simply by being able to give it a way to be assessed in a slightly more like-for-like manner than perhaps more simplistic or more one-dimensional type work. And this therefore could be, yes, it is not the answer, it is a contribution to a better answer that we can work on, and thankfully, again, over, I assume, a few years rather than having to get it done by next month. But from my point of view, I think, yes, the opportunities are there, as you say, at all three levels. And I know there are also hands going up in questions. I'll stop talking now, but I've found that fascinating, and again, happy to respond to any further points.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian and Loet. And in fact, this gives us about 10 minutes for a few final questions from the audience. So there was a raised hand from Maria del Carmen Calatrava. So if you want to ask your question, please unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I work at Technopolis Group, a consultancy firm working for public institutions, and we support and provide analysis to funders or research funders and other public institutions and science, research, technology. And something that you said I found very interesting, that one needs to choose the right indicators. And I am familiar with the Rao-Stirling index. I have been using it some years ago. And I'm not familiar with the synergies that you have presented today. And I'm very, very thankful that that I had the opportunity to attend this workshop. But I would like to know your opinion on what indicator to use if one is using certain kind of data. So, for example, with the Rao-Stirling index, what I was using was Web of Science and taxonomy of fields of Web of Science and similarity metrics. However, there are now other resources that are freely available, like, for example, lens.org and Microsoft Academic. And Microsoft Academic uses tree of disciplines, in which there are like 8 or so top disciplines, so like main disciplines, biology, computer science, and then in the form of an inverted tree, there are subfields of each of those disciplines. And then in that case, I at least have not been able to find nor to compute a similarity matrix. So, and therefore the Raustirling index, as far as I understand, would not be useful in that case, because we do not have a measure of similarity. But I am now thinking that perhaps the concept of synergies that you have presented today would be a way to to explore interdisciplinarity or synergies between fields with this inverted tree of disciplines. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Web of Science categories quite well, but not with the Microsoft inverted tree. I agree with you that it is always most useful to have first the raw data and then the similarity matrix, and then to go up from there, instead of doing it, talking about things without having those that type of information, because without that type of information, you can't say about anything whether it is significant or not significant, and you can easily go into making mistakes. I was just mentioning already that people, for example, the reasoning is often that one takes the Web of Science categories or other types of classifications because you shouldn't compare among disciplines. But this argument has gone astray, because what one then does is one takes the average of the one of those categories and takes that as the baseline. That means that you have the average in the denominator and you get the observed values in the numerator, and the observed values, one now understands that one shouldn't use the parametric statistics but the non-parametric statistics, and then you have a disbalance between the numerator and the denominator. We just published that paper in the SSRN, in the preprint server, and I can send you a copy if you wish, to show you how it can go wrong. I see it more as my role in this stage of how people are embracing and making money from bibliometric indicators, to point to those points where it can go wrong. For example, in the 80s, we had, for political reasons, the discussion about the decline of British science. That was wrong. That was also a mistake. It had been lined up with the Thatcher debate, and that's more my position, but I can understand that others are under pressure to deliver and that they can't all the time check what they are doing, that we have a certain arm's length. I agree with you that it's most important to think these things through before you go applying existing indicators. You have to really try to understand what you're doing. At least give it a serious effort.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that I answer your question.
No, so partially yes. Still, it is unclear to me how to proceed with an analysis of interdisciplinarity or synergies if one doesn't have these similarity metrics. So I guess that with the synergies, as far as I understood, it would be possible. With a Raustirling index, it would not be possible. So yes. I guess that the approach that you have presented today is a very attractive, precisely because of that, because the similarity metrics would not be needed.
Yeah, you have to distinguish between making the similarity matrix at the local level in the citation environment of a certain unit of analysis, or you do it at the global level, for example, for the whole Web of Science. And so it always gets into technicalities like that. yeah, of course, that's our job to make that type of. That's also your job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, excellent that people are already finding applications for your index in their work. I wonder if there are any more questions for Loet, because we are running out of time. And if there is one more question, perhaps we can take it. If there isn't any question, perhaps we can. Well, I had a question, but very late. I was really curious about this idea of how you whether synergy is something that can be measured. For example, can organizations themselves use measures of synergy to measure the opportunities in their knowledge base? So can it have an organizational application? And also the link between synergy and organizational structure, could you link the production of synergy to specific organizational structures? I think that would be a really fascinating area of research. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's really my colleague from Moscow. They have a different edition there, and it's enriching. We should work more with the Russians, more or less to say, because they're so mathematically grounded, naturally. I mean, to give this as an example, when we had the first paper on this measure in technological forecasting and social change, Inga and I, in 2014, then Inga said, let's go on and do this and that, extend it in this and that way. And I said, Inga, I have an unsolved problem. Can I pose that to you? And the next day, I received an email with the answer to that problem. That's so fascinating that people are able to do that. But may I turn it to Helen, who has looked at some of those synergy measures as I provided them for your unit, and had some conclusions from that. Is that a good idea, Helen? Or am I overloading you?
I think so. I think it would be. Yes, I think so. So yeah, I think it'd be great. So thank you very much, Loet. I think if we could just all unmute our microphone and clap, give a round of applause to Loet and Adrian and our discussants. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you.
Really nice dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So hopefully see you at the next CIMR seminar, which is going to be next Wednesday.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, and thanks to Orla and to Isabel for organising this too. So we are very grateful for the support we get. So thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Very nice seeing you. Bye.
Bye-bye.